pleasure to welcome you to this event. If you had told me 4 years ago when I arrived first at SOAS that I'd be involved in a sport diplomacy event, I would have been somewhat surprised. SOAS was not renowned for its sporting prowess. Things have changed over the last 4 years. It may have escaped your notice that we have one of our students in the England rugby team at the moment and doing extremely well. And indeed, sports and sports diplomacy is of growing importance to us as an institution. Sports, of course, matter for the regions that SOAS focuses on. Many of the world's most talented footballers now come from Africa. Many of the most talented cricketers, and perhaps even most of the most talented cricketers, come from India and South Asia. And many of the most talented baseball players, of course, come from Japan. Sports are a multi-million-dollar industry with wide commercial implications and cultural ramifications. It's through sports that I feel more English than anything else when I watch national football team, for good or bad. And it's also through baseball that my 9-year-old son, whose mother is American, feels more American than at any other time in his life. But sports diplomacy, this is important too. Diplomacy is not just about war and peace. It's not just about interstate relations. Indeed, the United Kingdom's Foreign and Commonwealth Office has long reorientated itself and a good part of its diplomacy towards business and culture, wielding, if you like, economic and soft power, as well as the more standard political power. But I'd say that the real ambassadors for any country are not the people appointed by the Queen to represent us at high level, but the ordinary people, the students, the sportsmen and women, and many others who travel around the world and make the world a place that it can be fun to live in. And I hope that we'll see that different side of diplomacy reflected tonight. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mana Takatori, Director General of the Japan Foundation, London. It is also my great pleasure to welcome you all to this symposium this evening. Well, sports attract many people because simply it's fun, it's exciting, it's healthy, it makes us feel good, feel better. And I admit it is very good timing for us to hold this symposium with the two mega sport events that Japan will be hosting in the near future. That is Rugby World Cup 2019 and Tokyo Olympic and Paralympic Games 2020. But this evening in this symposium, however, we are aiming to explore various aspects of sport, both positive and challenging in relationship with diplomacy. Today's high attendance, I think it's a strong proof that how everyone, not only academics, but also we ordinary citizens, really very interested in the impact of the sport, both positive and negative in this global arena, in this world. And through this symposium, Japan Foundation is very delighted to have been able to bring together very extensive knowledge and experience of the UK and Japan in conjunction with SOAS, with whom we are proud to have worked closely in partnership over many years, and with Japan Sport Council, whose role has become more and more important in recent years, especially the coming two mega sports event will be held in Japan. So in this symposium and in our activities in the future, we look forward to creating the new platforms and opportunities for fostering further conversation between Japan and the UK and beyond. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, all our guests, my name is Soji Sano from Japan Sports Council. I'd like to welcome you all, and I'm very honored to be here with you. And first of all, I'd like to express my great respect and gratitude to SOAS for their 100 years continuous effort and achievement. Here, I'd like to make some comment in regard to sports on behalf of Japan Sports Council. Today, you will see different perspectives on sports as well as its diverse values. Sports has inherent values such as spirit of competition and many benefits for our health. But sports is not about so much more. It teaches us about life. We can learn from sport not only about the joy of triumph, but also from learning of defeats with grace. And sports has a power to integrate the world. Now, sports is recognized and an influential instrument for promoting peace, understanding, and intercultural dialogue. And diplomacy is engaged with sports recently, and it receives remarkable attention. Almost 5 years has passed since the 2012 London Olympic Games now. In 2025, 5 years after the two mega sports events, what will remain in Tokyo and Japan? What we do today has an impact on what will remain in the future. So we need to utilize the value of sports in order to create a good legacy for the future generations. Finally, I strongly believe that the outcome of this symposium will impact on the process toward 2019, 2020, and beyond. And it is also my sincere hope that this symposium will be the kind of platform for sharing the opportunity to exchange opinions with experts in different fields. It must be our legacy. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. It's with much pleasure that I welcome you on behalf of both the Japan Research Centre and the Centre for International Studies and Diplomacy here at SOAS. I'd like to first say how great it has been to collaborate with the Japan Foundation and the Japan Sports Council. Tonight has come about because a few months ago, Takatori-san said to me that she'd like to do something with the JRC to mark our centenary. So I, of course, high-jumped at that, and within one's tenure as JRC chair, I think it's an acceptable leap now and again to choose something that neatly falls into one's own research field. So I thought, why not something on Japan and sport? So after a quick but very friendly scrum with Simon, our collective diplomacy swung into action, and it was then with remarkable speed that the Japan Foundation expertly passed the ball on to the Japan Sport Council. There, with agile teamwork, Sano-san formed a very impressive line-out. We have the Japan Sports Agency, Sport for Tomorrow, and the Japan Society for the Promotion of Sport. So suffice to say, I really just want to say a huge thank you to all those co-organisers and sponsors here tonight who have made this possible. And let's not forget Sake Samurai, who are upstairs right now, sitting up for our drinks reception later. I'm not sure how often sport and sake are teamed together in Japan, but I think you'll agree it sounds like a winning combination. So let's move on and tackle tonight's theme. We have 4 speakers, and then I will referee the Q&A afterwards. That's the end of my sports references. My colleague Simon will go first. He's going to provide us with an introductory framework on this coupling of sport and diplomacy. And then I'm going to look back on the 1964 Tokyo Olympics and try and draw out some themes of diplomacy and legacy from that event. And then we welcome Richard Cabourn, former Minister of Sport for the UK, who's kindly agreed to come all the way down from Sheffield today and speak about the legacy of London 2012 and his involvement with an Olympic legacy project in Sheffield. And finally, I'm really delighted to welcome Mr. Kimura, the Director General of the Japan Sports Agency, who generously agreed to come all the way from Tokyo to speak to us tonight. Thank you for coming over. He's going to give us an insight into Japan's Sport for Tomorrow program, which aims to harness the power of sport through various collaborative and global community initiatives. To my knowledge, this is the first time that the Japan Research Center has hosted an event focused solely on sport. And I hope that tonight, we already have a second one coming up in November, which I'll speak about later, but I hope that this will be the first of several events that we will be involved with as we build up to 2019 and 2020. So it's an opportunity for both academic and non-academic perspectives on the social value, impact, creativity, and energy offered by sport. Let's begin play.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for your attention. It's my great pleasure to be here this evening to talk about sport and diplomacy and to give you an insight into some of my research on this subject. A little scoping out exercise, given that I'm mindful of the different audiences we have in the room, both academic, practitioner, sportsmen and women, in fact, all sorts of citizen diplomats, as Richard referred them to. So a little bit about diplomacy, some of the issues and questions that arise in sport and diplomacy, just to give a flavour, I think, of some of the potentialities of what we are talking about here. A little bit about sports people as diplomats, and not just sportsmen and women as the athletes, but also the infrastructure, the administrators, and indeed some of the business experts who work within the realm of sport and diplomacy. And also pick up on the relationship between sport and the state and non-state actors, to think about who are the operatives, who are the practitioners of sport and diplomacy. So to begin, and to build upon the legacy of London 2012, this, for the photographers out there, you can pick out all of the wrong things with this photograph I took in August 2012. Whilst working as part of the LOCOG contingent in the International Relations Department, which is an academic who's worked in a number of international relations departments, was a different phenomenon entirely. But the International Relations Department of LOCOG dealt predominantly with this range of non-state actors in academic parlance, businesses, corporations, key sponsors, institutions representing athletes and different sporting federations. This conglomeration of different interests were represented and looked after by the International Relations Department of LOCOG. Now, what strikes me about this picture, really sort of got my academic juices flowing, is the representation and symbolism of the four flags on show here. So here we have, moving from left to right, the flag of the International Paralympic Committee, the United Nations flag, the London 2012 flag, and the United Kingdom's Union Jack. Now, what strikes me about this is there was probably the only occasion when those four flags would have been lined up next to each other. You have an international non-governmental organisation in the IPC. You have the United Nations, a universalist governmental organisation. You have London 2012, a private entity built around a single event, temporally defined. And then you have the representation or symbolism of a nation state, the United Kingdom. And it's the juxtaposition of each of those and the interrelationship that really gives birth to, at least in my mind, the importance of sport and diplomacy together. So by way of very brief recap on our diplomatic studies heritage and antecedents here. So diplomacy is about three things, as I would argue: communication, representation, negotiation, and occasionally agreement. But within that, and one often thinks of ambassadors and embassies in nice parts of Mayfair with highfalutin job titles. But diplomacy really can exist both within and without of the state. And I quote here diplomatic studies colleague by the name of Jeff Berridge. And what one can see in this definition here is it's very much about the apparatus of the state, diplomacy. And I think sport really helps to question the place of the state in the international system. And whilst that might be somewhat parochial academic discussion, actually within the realm of sport, the state has a necessary symbolic role. Often international sport is emblazoned with national flags. The tropes of symbolism are there throughout. But at the same time, many of the athletes, many of the processes, many of the institutions actually have quite transnational and international characters. And that we need to think about also. I think also it's worth making the point very explicitly up front, as I did to my students, about the relationship between diplomacy and politics. And they are not the same thing. They do not happen in just hand in glove. There is a relational character between sport and, between diplomacy and politics. One is about medium and one is about ends. They don't happen in a vacuum. So I'd like to throw out some issues. Maybe we'll pick up on some of them as we go through the rest of the evening, and certainly they're things we can return to. And I see sport and diplomacy as a function of something that I've written about more broadly in terms of global diplomacy. Thinking about the transactions that happen beyond nation and national boundaries. Thinking about the relationships, the communication that happens that encourages us to live together in a global community. That's not to prejudice a utopian view of some world government, but to look at the relationships and the points, the nexus between where we join up in that regard. I think also it's worth thinking about, and we'll come back to this, not least in terms of the commercial trademarks that are involved in sport, but thinking about the language and protocol of sport and diplomacy. Language and protocol form a key part of the diplomatic practice, but they also form a key part of sport. Understanding the rules of the game, the parameters of the pitch, the length of the track. These are all the sort of protocols of sport that we take for granted in many regards. But they've all been negotiated and agreed at some point. How long is the marathon? Why is it 400 meters? What's the length of the football pitch? All of these have come about by a process of negotiation, often based on anecdotal or perhaps local rules, but nevertheless, that there is a universal language. We know how long the 100 meters race is. There are also within this realm a sort of few classic examples, something that I almost think of as cliche in terms of sport and diplomacy. The boycotts of the Olympics in 1980 and 1984, the boycott of apartheid South Africa, the idea of ping-pong diplomacy and tarnished or embellished to some extent by Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger's exploits affiliating the PRC in the early 1970s, and the 1936 Olympics. Now, I'd argue in lots of those cases, they're perhaps not very useful examples. The diplomacy of national summits or G20 is not really the diplomacy that diplomats will experience on a day-to-day basis. Much of diplomacy, as those of you who practice it will recognize, can be rather boring. It's only the highlights, the summits, the matches that really capture the global attention and move you beyond that day-to-day process. And I think there's something about the temporal dimension of sport. The fact the season goes on and on. There's a fixture next weekend, or in the case of the Olympics, every 4 years. There's something about that timetable and schedule that brings a quality in of itself to reassurance, but also points of conflict. In that sense, this is the point I made about sport and politics. It's about sport and politics being about the end state, what you're trying to achieve out of hijacking an event such as National Socialist Party in Germany in 1936, taking advantage of the opportunity. But from the diplomatic perspective, I'm interested in how that medium is used. Why that opportunity? And I think also, I'm very mindful of the audience we have in here, thinking about the practice of sport and diplomacy. Who are the actors? Many of you will have partaken in sporting events overseas. The degree to which they are nationally represented, or simply a match of football on the beach with friends. Each of those has a representative quality, and I think that's an important dimension to consider. As such, we're not explicitly condoned, as Richard said, by a head of state to have an ambassadorial role. But we do adopt those tropes, be it a national celebration or a rendition of a national anthem. But equally, those aren't always just national tropes. Sporting clubs that traverse international competition. The European rugby final was up in Edinburgh over the weekend. There'll be other finals around that bring together different regional identities as well. And I think also we're looking increasingly in the realm of international diplomacy that sporting fixtures can provide those summatory moments. One of the telling images of the 2014 FIFA World Cup in Brazil was Chancellor Merkel at the World Cup final. From her point of view, unfortunately, given that Germany won, of course, fortunately, Germany won the World Cup final from her point of view. But it provided a nexus in contrast to her Brazilian counterpart, who was not held in high esteem by her local population at the time. So there's a public diplomacy message here. The German Chancellor chose to travel all the way to Rio for a message that also resonated within her local constituency back in Germany. And as such, my colleague Ivan Newman from down the road at the LSE has talked about the importance of sight in diplomacy. Where are those sites of diplomacy? Often they are, the cliched smoke-filled rooms, but nevertheless, sometimes they have a public occasion. Funerals are one from a former era. There's also a very clear agenda here about sport development and peace. And that's a field that's been largely owned by sociology colleagues. But nevertheless, the UN Office of Sport Development and Peace existed for 9 years. They've recently been folded within the IOC. How that plans out will be an interesting development. Very much akin to the way that under the Articles of the United Nations Charter, other activities that may seem to fall within the United Nations can be effectively subcontracted under Article 52. People have often commented about the way that NATO, by proxy and by retrospective vote, dealt with the United Nations mandates retrospectively with regard to Pristina Airport. Well, actually, I see a great deal of parallel here with the way that the IOC has taken over that role from the United Nations. And I think also we need to recognise and be very explicit about the participatory nature of sport and diplomacy. This isn't just the national team being picked. There's a great deal of networks of interrelationship between different components of sport. National sporting structures talk to other national sporting structures. Funding bodies, student, education, all of these have that transactional role that facilitates diplomacy. So a series of questions that with an army of PhD students I would like to tackle. Some of them at high level, to what extent does sport play a role in international diplomacy? Why and when and how? And particularly in relation to cultural diplomacy and the realms of public diplomacy, that is talking to an audience beyond the one immediately in front of you. So beyond the people within the stadium, in that sense. Talking to who else, what other sponsors, what other constituents, who are the stakeholders in that conversation. I think there's a great opportunity to discuss the issues of gender within sport and diplomacy. Sport and diplomacy as separate fields do not necessarily represent the gender balance within society, but both have an opportunity because of their communicative powers. The issue of identity becomes very much to the fore, not least because of the mixing up of it within sport and diplomacy. Is someone like Cristiano Ronaldo known as being Portuguese, or for playing for Real Madrid, or as a representative of a private company in Nike? All of these identities get mixed up and at various points play out within different audiences. I think also here we're talking about different lenses, from the very local to the global. And again, that transcends the nation state, which puts into question the role of traditional diplomacy in this regard. And so how do we move beyond sort of particular case studies? How do we build a global framework? And that's very much what I've seen some of my research as being about. To these sports people as diplomats, the two quotes I offer up here are separated by 62 years. The first was a comment written in the Times regarding England football team's appearance at the 1950 World Cup. Not a glorious chapter in England's footballing history, I mean, being beaten by the United States, an amateur team at the time. And the second quote is in respect to the England players ahead of the 2012 European Championships, when the England captain at that point, John Terry, was suspended for allegations of racial discrimination on the pitch. In both instances, the players have a diplomatic or an ambassadorial quality. Whether they acknowledged it and whether they followed it is perhaps mute, some more than others, needless to say. But I think also not only amongst the sporting individuals or the images of sportsmen and women on that page, but the administrators one needs to think about. And I think the administrators increasingly have an important role. One can think of examples of Joseph Blatter, as perhaps not the best example of how to be a top-level sporting administrator, but nevertheless, the importance of those individuals in shaping not only the sporting field, literally where tournaments are played, but also thinking about the transactions and the multi-million-pound transactions that follow. And as such, one of the features of my research has been to identify particular sporting entities, perhaps not a very elegant term, that in themselves can conduct diplomacy. So up here, the stadium for the New York Yankees, New Zealand All Blacks, Helen's first love, and the Real Madrid team from European champions from 2 years ago. Each of these entities can, by virtue of their global reach, their support base, and also, be very clear about it, their finance, have a diplomatic role. And this has been identified as again, perhaps an inelegant, a SINGO, a Sporting International Non-Governmental Organisation. By way of brief example to wrap up. Here's a photo of a Manchester United squad attending both the White House and then the British Embassy in Washington. Sir Nigel Shimel, the then ambassador to Washington, greeting two more Knights of the Realm, Sir Bobby Charlton and Sir Alex Ferguson. Now, Manchester United is out there to make money, to be very blunt about it. But it also has such a global presence that Sir Nigel took the opportunity of this visiting team to set up on the lawn of the ambassadorial residence in Washington a football pitch and run a football clinic during this visit. And he invited every member of the diplomatic corps in Washington, which is many of you will recognise is a pretty extensive one, and their wives and their children. And this was the most attended event that he held within his term of office, more so than the official dinner for Her Majesty the Queen. Now, that is a reach that gives an audience a commercial opportunity, no doubt, but also an important message one can send in that regard. There are four more episodes here. The United Nations and FIFA, and the United Nations and the IOC work hand in glove in many regards. There's a remarkable amount of coherence in the language and lexicon of FIFA's website and the United Nations website. A quick data search, good MA dissertation in this, really does line up those qualities, the verbiage, etc., etc. Now, recently, the Office for Sport Development and Peace has been devolved to the IOC. I think with the development of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the growing importance of sport to the realisation and development of peace really speaks to the opportunity that sport has here, and some of the opportunities that many of you will be involved in. And that's number 3 on the list here. This isn't lost down somewhere towards the bottom. Sport really is an important part of this, and we need to think in those sort of terms. But equally, I don't want to give too rosy a picture. I'm mindful here of some of the more negative side that sport can bring about. This image, taken from 1990, is a footballer by the name of Slawomir Boban, who was, responding to attacks, no doubt fueled by traditional football rivalries, between a Serbian team and a Croatian team. Events that gave rise to much of the tragedy that beset the Balkans in the mid-1990s. with recruitment to some of the particularly nasty aspects of that conflict coming directly from supporters groups within those two football clubs. Which reminds us of Orwell's remarks written not too far away from here in Senate House at the end of the Second World War, forgive me, about sport being war minus the shooting, by way of qualification. So there are opportunities here, and I'm looking forward to the rest of our discussion here. Sport and diplomacy doesn't always bring together people you would think it does, but it does provide opportunity, and it can have an influence at particular moments in time, and its temporal quality really speaks to one of the old tropes of diplomatic studies, Giudini's moment in time. And it does influence the conduct of sport, be it those people who are allowed into a country to participate, the shape of the tournament, etc., etc. On that, I will be quiet and pass over to my colleague. Thank you so much.
So we're going to travel back in time now to 1964, and I'm just going to reflect back on the Tokyo Olympics and try and draw out some of these themes of broadly diplomacy and legacy. It was a long path to Tokyo 1964. Some of you may know that Tokyo was the first Olympic Games held in Asia, but it was supposed to happen back in 1940, but for obvious reasons, the two wartime Olympics were cancelled. At the first post-war Olympics held in London, Japan and Germany were not permitted to attend, and the Soviet Union didn't send any sports athletes. But 11 years later, in an act of diplomacy itself, we might say, Tokyo was awarded the 1964 Games back in 1959. Now, Tokyo wasn't ready to host the Games in 1959, so it involved a massive 5-year investment in infrastructure. Very much the ambition of Tokyo 1964, part of the ambition was to bring Japan back into the world community, which we'll talk about a bit more. But it involved a massive urban transformation as well. This is a very good retrospective in the Japan Times that came out looking back at what it was like to live in Tokyo while the Games were being prepared. It was like living in a construction site, the whole city. But it was an opportunity, perhaps a necessity as well, but it was an opportunity for development here. They built superhighways, elevated highways. They ushered in the Shinkansen, the bullet train, which became a symbol of modern Japan. It was the fastest train in the world at the time. And of course, they built all the facilities that they needed for the Tokyo Olympics. So in the black and white photo, the Yoyogi National Stadium, which is still being used today, and the Nippon Budokan for the judo, which was introduced at Tokyo 1964. And that was made famous a few years later when the Beatles first played at the Budokan in 1966. It's a martial arts center, but it's also a rock band center as well. But it was an impressive investment, and it was very rapid. There's a lot of negative aspects to that as well, a lot of environmental fallout, relocation of people, but it was a massive infrastructural investment, estimated at around 4% of GDP at the time. Looking back at Tokyo 1964 itself, it was the first, as I said, Olympic and Paralympic Games in Asia, which meant that we completed the 4th continental circle of the rings. The 5th one is still to be completed yet. There have been no Olympics in Africa as yet. It was still known as the International Stoke Mandeville Games at that time, but it is, I believe, the first recorded use of the word Paralympic in the documentation and the artwork of the Games. And also in the use of the term Paralympic in the logo as well. And here you can see some images, the Japan team, the British team coming onto into the stadium and the opening ceremony of the Paralympic Games. I'm delighted to welcome Lord Holmes here this evening. He's a 9-time gold medal winner, GB winner of Paralympic swimming, so welcome. We are going to host a second event coming up in November. Our annual Beasley Lecture, which is held every year, is going to be dedicated to a history of the Paralympics. So if you would like to come along to that, please do. It's looking back at 64 onwards, the history of disability in the Paralympic Games in Japan. That's going to be our second sporting event. It was also the first time that the Olympics was telecast internationally around the world in colour, for colour televisions, using new underground cables, but also new satellite relay systems, the first use of computers to record Olympic statistics, the first use of snapshot photography. So here's a poster advertising the fact that the opening ceremony is going to be streamed live from Japan by the NBC. And of course, this gave the Japanese a very big opportunity to showcase their advanced technology. By this point in time, by the early 60s, Japan is starting to produce, as we know, automobiles, electronics, particularly TVs and cameras. And it's not surprising that a lot of people purchased a color television in order to watch the Olympic Games, not least in Japan, but abroad as well. So it gave Japan an opportunity to boost its production of key products and exports as well. It was a very visually coordinated, streamlined games. The artwork, the logo, was very bold and modest for the time. The use of the Hinomaru, the sun, which I'll talk about in a moment, was seen as very bold. They also had the first coordinated use of pictograms at this Olympics. The pictograms had been initially used somewhat in 1948, but then they used them in a very coordinated way at 1968, and they've been used ever since at Olympic Games. There were 20 sports at 1964, as you can see here. 2 new sports, one was judo and one was volleyball, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. It was also the first use of photographs in Olympic posters, very in colour obviously, and very much focusing on the physicality of the athletes. That physicality was also captured in the official Olympic film, Tokyo Olympiad. This was directed by the famous director at the time. You can see him on the right, smoking away in the stadium, Ichikawa Kon. And the Tokyo Olympic Organizing Committee took it upon themselves to finance this film and produce this film. And it's gone down, it's a milestone in Japanese documentary filmmaking. It was it was a big embarrassment for the organizing committee. They didn't like it. They said it was too artistic. But actually, it was later said that it was one of the best documentary films and one of the best sporting films ever made. With the marvels of technology, you can watch pretty much the whole thing on YouTube now. If you haven't seen it, it is a fantastic film to watch. You see these fantastic moments like Bikila here winning the marathon for the second time. And it often zooms in on, just focuses on athletes' muscles, their physicality, sets it to music, very blurry as people run past. It is very artistic in that sense. If you prefer anime, you can see the Tokyo Olympics in the Studio Ghibli film from up on Poppy Hill. This is set back in 1963, and it really captures what I was saying, that the whole of Tokyo was this construction site getting ready for the Tokyo Olympics. Like this sign here which says, let's hold a successful Tokyo Olympics in a beautiful city. So really trying to get the city ready for the Olympics. But certainly it was very much an opportunity for diplomacy. The elites of Japan, the organizers, very much had the objective to project a new image of Japan, or a new Japan to the world, to rehabilitate the image of Japan. And in order to do so, of course, what they really wanted to show that was Japan was now a peaceful nation, a modern nation, a very technologically advanced nation. Of course, this is the 1960s are the years of the income doubling plan, which was very successful. So Japan is in economic takeoff at this time. It's also not only to project that to the world, but to rebuild Japanese national identity as well. And there's a quote from a colleague here who was in primary school at this time, saying that as the ordinary Japanese watched the Olympics, they felt this was the beginning of Japan's rise, very much driven by the media and the use of television at this time. But as it says here, as they watched the athletes, they felt this national unity and pride growing throughout the course of the games. And this was very much promoted by the media at the time as well. Diplomacy was interesting. It was not very controversial games, which was quite amazing in some ways when you look back on it. The emperor opened the games, which 20 years before would not have been thought of, that he might stand there and open the games. They, of course, used the national flag, which wasn't the national flag until 1999. They sang the national anthem, which wasn't the national anthem until 1999. But what they were doing is, of course, rehabilitating these perhaps previously divisive symbols in a new peaceful arena. And the whole arena of the Olympics is an opportunity to bring out these symbols of nationalism, flags, anthems, etc. And the Japanese were able to bring out these symbols that hadn't been seen in Japan so much in the 50s and 60s. They also had the self-defense force there to help guard the games, transport athletes, do the ceremonial rituals, do fanfares, etc. And also, very symbolically, the flame was lit by Sakai, who was born in Hiroshima on the day that the atomic bomb was dropped. So there was a lot of subtext going on during the Olympics that perhaps ordinary people weren't really picking up on, but was helping to unite them behind this new Japan. I'm going to talk a little bit about gender. It's the first Olympics for women's team sports. There had been individual sports and some of them at a team event, but this was the first time that women's team and ball sports were introduced to the Olympics, and this is because of the inclusion of volleyball, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. This is the final, the Japan versus the Soviet Union. Sport is very gendered still, not least in terms of the financial investment in sport and the media coverage of sport. But I'm sure you'll recall that London 2012 did a lot, has built up towards quite more gender equality in sport. London 2012 was the first Olympics where all sports had at least one event for women. All countries sent female athletes, and women made up 44% of the athletes. This has built up over time, this narrowing of the gender participation gap. So at Tokyo, women made up only 13% of athletes, and only 7 out of the 20 sports pictured here had women's sports. So even though it's seen as the first Olympics for women's team sports, it was only volleyball, really. So women's events in basketball, football, hockey, not yet. And it was only with boxing in London 2012 that all the events had at least one female event. But my research has mostly focused on this story of volleyball at the Tokyo Olympics. And this team was known as the Witches of the Orient, which they didn't mind, actually. I did ask the captain if they minded that nickname, but they didn't mind. It was, the witch was because of the magic of their play, not an evil connotation. The volleyball final was held a day before the closing ceremony, and it still holds, I believe, the NHK record for the most watched event in Japanese television history. A lot of pressure and media build-up on this team in the build-up to 1964, a lot of expectation that they would win the gold medal, a lot of focus on their tactics, their training, their gender, their physicality, their age, their marital status. And it's really sort of the early beginnings of celebrities. This partnership of the coach, Daimatsu on the right there, and the captain, Kasai, this very intense focus on their partnership, and they became celebrities after this. She was followed around afterwards by television cameras when she got married, etc. So it's the start of celebrity focus, if you like, in Japan at the time. Luckily, they won the gold medal because there was so much pressure on them. Luckily for them, but I think being the day before the closing ceremony and the high expectation, I think we can see this victory not just as a victory for this team itself, but it really symbolized this culmination of all the effort, all the build-up that had gone into staging Tokyo 1964. And it's very much remembered, particularly by the generation who watched the Olympics at the time. So what can we say about legacy? In terms of volleyball, it's got a very interesting legacy that hasn't really played out so much in the literature, but they inspired the mass popularization of volleyball in Japan, particularly for older women. Volleyball had been a very popular sport for young women. It became very popular in TV programs and anime and manga later. But more importantly, I think, it became the most popular sport for older women in the post-war years. So it became acceptable after this for housewives, for mothers to play volleyball. And it became the #1 sport for women in Japan. But since the Nareshiko football team have been popular, I think football's competing with volleyball now as well. That's Kasai, the captain in later life. She very much helped spread this popularity of sport. I think we can also probably see Tokyo 1964 as a legacy for Asia. It marked the start of Asia rising, both economically and in the sporting hosting of Megasports domain. So Japan, of course, went on to host some Winter Olympics. It also co-hosted the FIFA World Cup with South Korea, which was required a certain level of diplomacy in itself for those two nations to co-host. And of course, we are looking toward Tokyo 2020. There's been two subsequent Olympics, of course, in East Asia, the Seoul, Beijing. Both of those gave opportunities as well for those cities and those nations to showcase their economic advancement where they were at in that time. And the next two Winter Olympics are going to be in South Korea and China as well. So, I mean, the games are quite Eurocentric and, because of their origins, but this message of the 5 rings of spreading the hosting of the games out across the continent is growing. Although there are vast places where, of course, there's been no games hosting as yet. So it's very concentrated in East Asia, 3 countries essentially, very much in Europe and North America. So nothing yet in Southeast Asia or South Asia or Middle East or Africa as yet. That legacy continues. So just as the 2002 FIFA World Cup was billed as the first FIFA World Cup in Asia, the Rugby 2019 is also being billed as the first Rugby World Cup in Asia. Perhaps it's about time, because Japan has actually been playing rugby for quite a long time, although it's competed with other sports along the way. It had a big boom in popularity in the 20s with the British influence and university teams, but also there's been a big rise in post-war teams as well, corporate teams. The volleyball, women's volleyball was actually a corporate team as well, so there are a lot of corporate teams of sport in Japan. Japan has played in all the Rugby World Cups, and of course we all probably remember the fantastic victory over the Springbok a few years ago. And the game of rugby itself is, the popularity, of course, has very much increased in Japan since the Blossoms victory, but the game of rugby itself is really growing in Asia, not least because of the game of rugby sevens. So particularly the expansion of the HSBC World Rugby Series across Asia and other continents, the inclusion of rugby sevens in the Olympics now since Rio, and also the rapid growth in women's rugby gets far less media attention, but it is going to be held in Ireland later this year in August. Women's FIFA World Cup and Women's Rugby World Cup are growing in popularity and media coverage over time. As Richard said, we hopefully have a SOAS connection to the next Rugby World Cup. Our current student Maro, nicknamed Super Maro, he is hopefully going to be competing. I did invite him along to be a speaker tonight, but he's very busy. He's doing his SOAS exams and he's also training for the Lions tour to New Zealand. But he was kind enough to email back and say he wished us every success for tonight's event. But being a Kiwi, my final word on the Rugby Cup is that, really. If you haven't yet seen this video of the All Blacks rampaging through Shinjuku, Google it. It's fantastic seeing them tackle everybody in Shinjuku. So that's my final word on rugby. So how can we pull this all together? It's a big topic. I've romped through it, but just thinking within our theme and looking back and looking forward. I think Tokyo 1964 was much more than just a mega sporting event, and that's not to discount, of course, the fact that it was a fantastic sporting event. As a colleague said, most remembered are the moments of sporting glory. But it did much more than that, and particularly for the Japanese, it left a deep impression on the ceremonies, the rituals, the uniting of the nation. And as those films showed, I think the Olympics marked the milestone for many Japanese. And also when they think back on the 60s, the Olympics is very prominent still in their minds. So mega sporting events can be an opportunity for many things, as Simon said. So it can be an opportunity for political diplomacy, both within countries and externally. There can be opportunities for economic diplomacy. It's not always financially profitable to host these mega sporting events, but some of the spillovers can be advantageous. Certainly there is levels of cultural diplomacy there in terms of projecting soft power, celebrating sport, and of course social diplomacy as well, particularly diversity and inclusion, with closing the gender gap in sports, and of course the powerful rise of the Paralympics as well. So what will we look forward to? We don't know how Tokyo 2020 is going to go yet, but certainly Tokyo and Japan are a very different place than they were in 1964. It's no longer economically booming. not to end on a negative note, but we often think, academics describe Japan now as a post-growth economy, post-growth society. But that's not necessarily a negative thing. When we look at post-growth measures, we look at happiness index, well-being, sustainability. So maybe that will come out when we look at the staging of Tokyo 2020 and its legacy. Thank you.
Good. It'll work, will it? Definitely work. Thank you very much, Ellen. Well, thank you very much for inviting me this evening to, I think the title of my speech was After London 2012 Olympics, The Legacy. But the last time I was in this lecture theatre was actually celebrating an anniversary of the anti-apartheid movement, to which I was close. And Richard, when I heard your words this evening, I thought it did reflect back, and I always carry these, ironically, in my wallet, and it did reflect back to the person who we were trying to get out of jail in those days, the anti-apartheid movement, who, in his book, The Long Walk to Freedom, wrote some, I think, the words that probably encapsulate the whole question of diplomacy and the real power of sport, when Mandela said that sport is the power to change the world, the power to inspire, the power to unite people in a way that little else can. It speaks to people in a language they understand. Sport can create hope when there was only despair. And they're powerful words, I think, from a person that clearly incarcerated for so many years, but I think as the photograph on there showed how in one Rugby World Cup, one person walking to another person could actually unite a nation, as he did when Madiba walked onto that World Cup and presented that cup. And that is the power of sport. I've been asked to just say a few words about the journey, I think, to some extent, of 2012 and how it started, what were the decisions we took in its early days, what are some of the lessons of that, and I can say to my colleagues in Tokyo, well, you're now 3 years out from the Olympics, it must be a bit of a nervous time because you never quite know where it's going to go, and I can assure you it was pretty nervous in London and the UK at that time. But I think it was very interesting. Someday I will write a book about how we actually did win the Olympics. I've read many stories of it, and it's been given many slants, but I can remember in 2001, November 2001, two guys came into my office when I was the sports minister, and indeed I'd only just become sports minister that year, and Simon Clegg and Craig Reedy, respective officers of the British Olympic Association, which we've got represented here this evening as well, which is good to see. They walked into my office in 2001 and said, "We want to bid for 2012, 11 years out." And I just, as a sports minister, which Tony Blair had said as Prime Minister, would I look at sport and see how we can use sport as an agent of change? How can we use it more to deliver government policies than we had been doing previously? And that was my job in restructuring sport. So I took that and said, in 2001, do we make a bid for the Olympics or don't we? What would the Olympics actually bring to the UK if we were actually going to make that bid and indeed win that? And it was a discussion that took place, and I asked my officials then, PermSec of the DCMS it was then, still is, and said, would you please give me a view on whether we ought to make a bid for the Olympics? I got a 6-page letter back. It's been actually out on Freedom of Information, so it's all on the record. I got a 6-page letter back. 5 pages why we shouldn't bid, 1 page why we should, and the end of it said, and I will draft a letter to the Prime Minister saying why we shouldn't make a bid for the Olympics. I said at the bottom, thank you very much, that's not going to be the decision. And then the next guy, who I got a tremendous amount of respect, was my sports director, and he came into my office and said, Minister, are you serious? And I said, yes, I am. He says, we really need this like a hole in the head. Now, that was in 2001. And in 2002, we then decided to make that bid. And I shall never forget when Tessa Jowell and myself were at a cabinet committee, a subcommittee, and we went round the table and there wasn't one single minister supporting the bid for 2012. So we didn't set off in a particularly, I think, strong position, but we argued the case, and we argued that case because we believed that we could bring about fairly fundamental change, not just in sport, but indeed what that sport can affect. And I think that we have been really successful in that. But just before we get to the actual bid that we did in 2005, what was hugely interesting was to try to get support, the diplomacy that's been, I think, referred to by Simon, to some extent Helen as well, and going to say, why should we have it in London? Why should the world, why should the IOC, why should the Olympic Committee actually say London is going to be the place to do that? And I was a tremendous experience because I went around the world and I spoke to a huge amount of people. I, was in Moscow, I went to Barcelona, I was in Munich, I went down to Australia, and spoke to a huge amount of people. And in that, got, I think, a tremendous amount of inside knowledge of what to do and indeed not what to do. Now, I'm not going to bore you with it this evening. But I think it did lead us, and led me definitely, in 2005 to take the Olympic bill through Parliament. But I do believe it created a framework of public policy that was actually going to stand us in good stead even now on the developments, one I'm going to go into a little later. But also there was some interesting events around that. The bidding committee came into my office and said, can I get Nelson Mandela to support London? I said, well, it's a bit difficult. So as I said earlier, that I did actually know Nelson Mandela, Madiba, reasonably well. So I thought, well, you can't actually ask him on the telephone. So I actually went down to Johannesburg and asked to see Madiba, and we did, and we discussed. I didn't ask him quite crudely, that will you support the bid, but we got a discussion. And one thing that Madiba had was a great love for the Queen. When you think back, we were the only Commonwealth bidding country for the 2012 Games as well. So I took a little bit of poetic license, as they say, and said the Queen had sent me down as the head of the Commonwealth, and could you support? And of course, Madiba said, well, I love the Queen, so he signed it off, and that is a true story. Probably a little bit longer than that, but it was a fantastic. It was, and I think one of those things that helps you to win bids. We only won by 3 votes. In Singapore when the bid was made in July 2005. So there are tipping points in this, and when you can actually use that soft diplomacy, I think I think it worked quite well. The other one was an interesting story, was, again, talking about the power of sport, talking about the power of Manchester United. We could talk about the power of David Beckham in the bid, because when we wanted David Beckham to go, nobody could get round his agent. So I had to get Sven, who was then managing the England side, into my office and said, Sven, we really want David to go to Singapore. He phoned me back, he said, Richard, it's his first wedding anniversary, it's a bit difficult. I said, well, we'll take his wife as well. So we did just that, and that's a long story, but nevertheless, David arrived in Singapore and did an absolutely fantastic job for us. But I think many who were in this country when we won that bid in 2005, in July 2005, it's one thing that really brought the nation together about something, a great hope. Trafalgar Square, where you saw Kelly Holmes and Stevie Cramp jumping up when Jack Rogge read out London. It was, I think, I was in Singapore, but I saw the films after that, and it was one hell of an experience. But the one thing that we were looking at as we developed the Olympic was after Singapore, was how are we going to actually develop that legacy? Now, I just want to, on 3 areas, there were many, but there are 3 areas I just want to go through this evening to say, where you can really start making a big impact on legacy. And sometimes it's not always recorded, I don't think, as effectively as it ought to be. I was in the East End of London at a wedding last night, and I reflected as I stood there at the side of the Thames and looked at the O2, but then looked at the Olympic Park. One of the big debates that I had when I was a minister for the regions was, how do you rebalance London? London is a very unbalanced capital. Why? Because it's got Heathrow out to the west. And the one thing that we were trying to do, and I say this across party because Michael Heseltine was one of those, that was trying to actually get the economic activity of the east side of London to start balancing. So you would have a more equal growth inside the capital. And whilst the Canary Wharf and the developments down there were having some effect, the one thing that's really to start to rebalancing the great capital of this country, one of the greatest capitals in the world, has been the Olympic Games. It started rebalancing that economics, and that's the argument that we've had, and I think you see way beyond now the Olympic Park is the big developments that's going on there, way beyond the O2 there, and that has been part of, I believe, one of the great gains of the Olympics, how it's actually done that regeneration of the East End of London. It brought an absolute focus onto that and started that growth there, but it's gone beyond that, and it's gone beyond, I think, it's gone to doing something that we have been trying to do and spent billions of pounds in doing, which was rebalancing this great capital of ours. The second area, which happened in 2006, 2007, it was how are we going to make sure that the GB team perform on the world stage. And this was the GB team, both the Olympics and the Paralympics as well. And we then took the view that we had to invest in that. And a guy called Peter Keane, and this is an absolutely true story, and he came into my office with people from UK Sport. He was the performance director then, and Peter Keane said, if we want to win the medals, 65 medals in London, and this was in 2005-06, if we want to win 65 medals, we have to invest. And he laid out a whole matrix of how we should invest in elite sport, how we could actually make sure that we wrapped around our athletes a system, a structure that would actually deliver on the world stage. And, in fact, in 2012, that investment, it was £300 million. We had to negotiate that with the Treasury on top of the lottery money. But it gave us a foundation, which is still there today, because people said, did it happen by chance? No, it didn't. It happened because there was a systematic investment into sport, in some of the best sports science, sports medicine, sports psychology, sports engineering, that probably in the world. And now, I think that we saw, from Beijing into London and into Rio, that investment that continued to go into that elite sport. And that was not just down to one person, but he led that team. And some of us argued that that was the right investment to do. And so I do get a little annoyed sometimes when I hear in our press that really we don't have to invest in excellence, we don't have to invest in those medals. I think we do, because I think the spin-off from that is huge as well. And I think it would be a mistake. There are things that can happen, and one of the things that is going to happen, which I'm going to come to now, because what we've been able to do, I think, with the third element of that, is to look at what Seb Coe was saying, and we were all saying at the time, is what is the real legacy? Why spend £9.3 billion on running Olympics for 5-6 weeks? Is it a big event? Which we spent 9.3 just on the infrastructure. That wasn't the actual running of the games themselves. And that has to be justified now. And I think to some extent the IOC now are finding out that they have got to justify that type of expenditure, because it's okay pre-2008, but post-2008, after the financial crisis, it's very difficult to justify in a world that austerity, unfortunately, is the order of the day, financially, economically, that you can actually justify the type of expenditure that these big events actually demand. And so what we have been looking at is how we could, and we said this before 2008, this was back in 2007, we were trying to look at how we could use elite sport, a bit like the Formula One car. What happens in a Formula One car today happens in the luxury car market the day after, happens in the volume car market the day after that. So how do you take that knowledge, that intellectual property of an elite athlete, and move that into the well-being and the health of the nation? And that was one of the challenges that we were looking at in developing the legacy for the Olympics. 3 years ago, I got the opportunity to start putting some of this into practice, because my leader of the council in Sheffield said to me that part of a sports facility that had been used for the World Student Games in 1991 was actually now costing a huge amount of money, and we had to find another use for that. And it gave the opportunity to bring in two great universities together, the largest teaching hospital in the country, one of only 4 children's hospital, and a fairly vibrant private sector together with a good local authority. And all those actors came together to say, how can we find a solution to a problem that we had in Sheffield, which is my hometown. That's the steelworks in Sheffield, Brown Baileys. And on that steelworks was built that. For those who know, that's Don Valley Stadium, or was Don Valley Stadium, not anymore, that's not. That was Don Valley Stadium, that's where Jessica Rennis used to run, and it's where Stevie Cram and many others have run around that. But it was, unfortunately, losing a huge amount of money and had to find a solution to it, as I say, in these austere times. So we brought all those actors together and we said, how can we use sport in a much more effective way? That was the statement that Seb made in 2012. One of the greatest ambitions of 2012 is to have a lasting legacy of health. Our partners in East Midlands, London, Sheffield, want to take world-class research and provide services that will deliver long-term systemic change to the benefit of the health of the nation. And that's what we have been trying to do over the recent past, about the last 3 years. That is the site now, which was Don Valley Stadium, and that is the Olympic legacy part that we're developing. That is it now. That's the indoor track at the EIS. That's some of the remedial work. That is a school that is now built on that. It will have just under 2,000. It's a through school, two-year-olds to 16 years of age. That is University Technical College, and that is doing life sciences, sports sciences, and digital and computer, and is training the workforce of the future. This is an indoor arena, and this is built by the private sector. And that is a 3G pitch that is actually laid now. That's not the one that's down there, but and that's going to be used by the UTC and the Oasis Academy. That's the landscaping on the public realm that we're doing landscaping there. That's the side program. What we've tried to do, and I'll come to the Advanced Wellbeing Research Centre, we've tried to actually prove three things in this. One is that we're saying, can we use facilities much more effectively? Because one of the big problems you have, and I've no doubt every Olympics has it, can you use facilities more effectively? And what we've done on this part is brought health, education, elite sport and community sport together. So when you look at the school will use the facilities that are there of the 3G pitch. It will also use the indoor facilities of the basketball as well. The University Technical College, which is a major technical college for developing and training the workforce in the future, are also using those facilities as well. And that's alongside all the elite sport, because training in there is the world champion of boxing now, Anthony Joshua, who still trains there now. That's where Jessica Rennis trains there, and many of our future athletes, future Olympians train there as well. So there's a mix of these young people, because you could go into the English Institute for Sport and you'll see Anthony Joshua running around the track, you should see Jess Ennis running down the back straight, and in the middle of it would be the youngsters having a sports day. And therefore the mix of that was just day-to-day life, and one that was taken by those young people, but inspiration, I think, was the order of the day as well. Now, this is the Advanced Wellbeing Research Centre. It's just commencing construction now. What we did in the legacy and in discussion that Seb was talking about, we have a National Centre for Sports and Exercise Medicine. We are 1/3 of that in Sheffield, and we have taken that National Centre for Sports and Exercise Medicine, and we have now got 3 developments. There will be 5 eventually. One of those that Bill and the Seb Cove was up a few weeks ago. We have 19 consultancy rooms in the middle of a sports facility. And you walk through that now at the Graves, and you have a desk for the NHS, and you can go and have a consultation, or you can go and have a swing, play badminton, you can play. What has been absolutely remarkable there is people walk in there who will be coming, who may look at that, go to hospital, we've got referrals from doctors, we've got discharges from hospitals coming there. Instead of feeling ill that you have to do when you go in a hospital, when you go into a sports environment, it's a totally different attitude and mind that one has. And what is now we are seeing is that that is getting through the whole system. We've now, I think it's something like 40,000 referrals there now by the end of this year. We have 3 of these centres, and we broke the city of Sheffield, which is 500,000 people, we broke that down into 51,000 parts, so we can now measure. All that information, that data, that would probably not be recorded as effectively ought to be, is now being locked into the Advanced Wellbeing Research Centre here, which is an investment that we persuaded the government to do a couple of years ago, £14 million, and it is now collating all that information. But more importantly, that is an interface not just of academia, with the universities, the teaching hospital, children, but also with the private sector. And more than that, the private sector are helping to run that, in that it is developing an innovation to help people move. It's a living laboratory. It's building on the success of the National Centre for Sports Exercise Money, which is collaborative research to make products like apps, technology, sports equipment, and so on. We have Toshiba now, who is a Tier 1 member. We have Westfield, which is a big help for me, and we are looking now with others who will come in, and they actually set the generic research of the programs that go in there. And so collectively, those who have got a vested interest in helping to get people to move more often, which sounds very simple, but it is actually the actual base. If you go and talk to any doctor, you talk about obesity, and that this is the area which is the most difficult. We've also now signed up Park Run. For those that know Park Run, Saturday mornings, 9 o'clock, there's, I think it's something that they've gone to 1 million people now that's gone through the Park Runs. We have got all the data now coming into the Advanced Wellbeing Research Centre, and that is now collecting that data, and it will be actually disseminating that into all sorts of sports sciences, sports medicine, sports engineering, sports psychology, because that information, and we can test that, and we measure that. And therefore, the investment the private sector are putting in is being measured, and indeed is going into the product. And that's not just national, that's international. I say we've got Toshiba on there as well. That is what we are. That's the development, and we're extending that development. But there are two other that we are now looking at, and that is orthopaedic research. There are two pathways. There is the patient pathway that we've looked at through the National Centre for Sports Exercise Medicine, and particularly with MSK, and people going into that with real difficulties. But do you actually change that by changing lifestyle, or if they do want to then have some type of operation orthopaedic? We're now bringing the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre, and that's the medical MRC, as a pathway of technology, implants and its development there, with the patient pathway coming across there. Those two pathways are converging, and we're building an orthopaedic research and rehabilitation innovation centre, which is actually looking right across the whole question of MSK problems and how you can intervene. And then intervention, again, big involvement from the private sector, with companies like B. Braun, who are making a lot of medical equipment and the like. They are now coming into this research centre in a way that will be able to converge those technologies to actually develop the products of the future, and indeed the systems of the future as well. And this comes into the bigger development, advanced manufacturing sector and innovation centre that we're developing around that. It has been a fundamental change in the way that some of our approaches to health and well-being have been, which has been driven to a large extent by sport, both at elite, professional, and the community sports as well. I just finished probably on this note, probably gone too long anyway, overcoming obstacles there. These are some of the gains that the local authority has got from that. But I think the other big gain, and it's good to see the BOA here this afternoon, and I said this very genuinely, for their support, because we've had a little, as it were, difference of opinion with the International Olympic Committee by using the word Olympic. And I do want to take note of this from Tokyo. But I think what has dawned on the IOC is that when a city or a nation invests £9.3 billion, they're going to want a little bit more out of it than what they've got previously. And we've had some great things out of them, so I accept that. But I think this agenda of health and well-being is really uppermost in a lot of developed countries' minds. It is costing us well in excess of £100 billion on the health service. It's how do we get prevention rather than cure? What is the role of sport into physical activity, into well-being? And we have had this discussion. We've wrote out a plan for the IOC, that 10-point plan, that is actually the basis of what we've been doing here, and saying that you ought to incorporate this and reward those that are prepared to go down that course, that they can use, with some pride and with some justification, the word Olympic. So whilst I registered this as the Legacy Park Limited, I've now got, through the good officers of the BOA, and their negotiation skills with the IOC, we're now going to get to a point where we will call this the Olympic Legacy Park Sheffield. And I think that's quite powerful. It's quite powerful in that the Olympic movement now is genuinely moving in a legacy. Because one of the arguments you get for these huge expenditures on multi-sports events or in big international events, and I brought out that Tokyo will be the same, is how do you justify that legacy? I personally think, in terms of what we did in 2012, we've justified it in at least those three areas that I have said. We've rebalanced the City of London economically by what we did in the Olympics. I think what we've been able to do in terms of bringing the best sport in terms of elite and the spin-offs from that has been huge, and I think the health and well-being agenda will, in many, many ways, be affected by what the Olympics did in 2012. And it is building that type of legacy in that I think is so important if we're going to continue to justify the type of public money that goes into these huge events. Thank you very much.
We're running a little bit late, but don't worry, the sake will still be waiting for us. So you just...
Good evening and konbanwa. I'm very honored to be invited to this seminar on the occasion of celebrating the SOAS. And the UK is very much advanced in terms of competitive sport and sport participation, and also anti-doping policy based on the legacy of London Olympic and Paralympic Games. I have visited several times London in order to learn from your experiences. In Japan, the consecutive 3 years starting from 2019 are called golden years for sport. And to be specific, Rugby World Cup in 2019 and Tokyo 2020 and World Masters Game in the western part of Japan in 2021. Against this background, I would like to share with you our endeavor towards Tokyo 2020 and beyond. And these are the topics of today. I start with introduction of Japan Sports Agency, which was created 2 years ago. Then I explain the outline of the SFT and ongoing activities. As a conclusion, I would like to touch upon the legacy of the project. Now I would like to start with the Japan Sports Agency to which I belong. And in 1964, Japan hosted Tokyo Olympic and Paralympic Games, as explained before. At that time, a new law on promotion of sport was enacted and awareness of sport was significantly enhanced. Sport participation increased across the country. Since then, more than 50 years have passed and the environment surrounding sport has drastically changed. For this reason, in 2011, the Basic Act on Sports was enacted to replace the old one. In addition, the successful bidding for Tokyo 2020 facilitated the decision to establish the Japan Sports Agency, which should lead a comprehensive policy covering all sports-related activities. The JSA was established in October 2015, aiming at realizing a society in which citizens can lead a healthy and fulfilled life through sport. The value and power of sport based on the enjoyment of sport is the core mission of the JSA. In establishing JSA, its mandate was expanded drastically, in addition to the traditional task of competitive sport. The new mandate covers also the promotion of health through sport, international cooperation, the revitalization of regional society, as well as promotion of business through sport in close cooperation with the relevant ministries. And he is my boss, and Mr. Daichi Suzuki, the gold medalist of Seoul Olympics for backstroke. He is the first commissioner of JSA and gives vigor to the agency. Our agency has around 120 personnel, and 30 of us are seconded from private sector and different ministries, including myself. We try to open the frontiers for sports in Japan. And now I would like to move on the theme of today's Sports for Tomorrow. And SFT is a legacy project for Tokyo 2020 and proposed by Prime Minister during the bidding process. And it aims at making contributions through international cooperation and exchanges in sport, targeting more than 10 million people in over 100 countries between 2014 and 2020. And for its implementation, we have set up the Secretariat and the Executive Committee composed of relevant ministry and implementing agencies. A consortium is built with the participation of the private sector. This public-private partnership facilitates information sharing, project certification, project matching, and the best use of existing resources. And at the beginning of the project, we have only 29 members, but now we have more than 300 partners. We witness significant growth of interest among the private sector, including NGOs, private companies, universities, and local governments. And one important feature of SFT is the project matching among the partners by providing with know-how, goods, or financing based on their own merit and strengths. I show you one example of supporting for table tennis in Mongolia, and Japan Table Tennis Association provides trainings, and Japanese company provide with equipment. And the Mongolian team won the silver medal at the Special Olympics. And in addition to international cooperation, fostering human resources is another important area of SFT projects. We have established the international base for fostering human resources in sport in Japan, including the master degree courses for sports management at Tsukuba International Academy for Sports Studies. Japanese and foreign students are learning together, and the first group of students graduated last March, and we are working with AISTS in Switzerland. Now I'd like to explain the concrete aims and also the ongoing activities of the SFT by showing typical SFT projects which we would like to promote. And we have three overall aims for SFT. And first aim is to diffuse sport and raise international competitiveness in sport. And we are working with many countries, in particular developing countries, by inviting athletes to Japan or sending trainers to partner countries. For example, we make the most of Rugby World Cup in Japan to make rugby popular in Asia by inviting coaches to workshops. And second aim is to change the world through the power of sport by addressing challenges in societies. Third aim is to make sport exchanges part of national culture. Today, I would like to focus on the second aim of addressing the global challenges through sports, on which we put the priority. To achieve the sustainable development goals, sport is regarded as useful tool and effective tools. We would like to join the international efforts by addressing the various global issues with the power of sports, as shown on this slide. And as I mentioned before, promotion social changes through the power of sport is the core mission of the Japan Sports Agency. We decided on a 5-year action plan, starting from this April, ending in 2020 based on this core mission. And our catchphrase is sport changes, shaping the future, enjoy sports, enjoy life. And this motto means that people's lives change through sport, then sport can change society and connect with the world, which will lead to shaping the future. In terms of connecting the world, we emphasized that sport can contribute to a world that respects this diversity and inclusiveness, a world that is sustainable and resilient, as well as a world that is clean and fair. And based on this concept, we are promoting following 3 agenda, namely sport for all, sports for development and peace, and protection and promotion of sport integrity. Those 3 are shared as international policy agenda in various frameworks such as UN and UNESCO. The UN General Assembly has adopted a series of resolutions on sports for development peace, and special advisors on sports for development have been appointed by the UN Secretary General to advance this agenda. And UNESCO is the UN agency responsible for sports, and UNESCO adopted International Charter on Physical Education and Sports in 1978, which was revised in 2015. And the UNESCO Sports Ministers Conference adopted Berlin Declaration in 2013. Those documents cover those three agendas as well. And our government intends to enhance our engagement in the international policy discussion by showing good practices which promote internationally shared agenda. And first agenda is sports for all that will contribute to an inclusive society. Under this agenda, we provide the opportunity of sports for all that include children and young people, women, persons with disabilities, and elderly. We aim at realizing a healthy society through lifelong sport by introducing ideas from Japan. For example, radio exercises, sports days of Japanese style, as well as physical education curricula. Radio exercise is stretching with music that Japanese people feel anyone can do it at any place. In Japan, radio exercise are broadcast at the regular time, every day, both in TV and radio, so that everybody, from children to the elderly, can do exercise regularly. We find these exercises useful to promote health for everyone. We organize sessions in many countries by sending trainers and providing with pamphlets. And in India, many people took part in the radio exercise sessions and Japanese-style sports day. On the occasion of Honolulu Marathon and Tokyo Marathon, we organized sessions with participation of thousands of people. And Undokai is a Japanese-style sports day that takes place at every school once a year. And Undokai consists of events including foot race, relays, a tug of war, and other team games which children can join easily. Children can enjoy the events and learn rules, fairness, and discipline at the same time. And Japanese NGOs organize Undokai in many countries. And last December, a new middle school physical education curriculum was approved in Cambodia. This project was supported by a Japanese NGO. And Tsukuba University offered table tennis classes in Kenya and the chance for girls to identify problems and solutions they are facing in terms of education, health, or other issues. A follow-up will be made to address the issues raised by the girls. And a training program was provided for young staff of the National Paralympic Committees of the ASEAN countries in Japan. And we train the young leaders of parasports. And spreading parasport is an area in which we would like to be more engaged. We provide also training courses for wheelchair basketball and other sports in other countries. And we are promoting a series of so-called inclusive sports created in Japan. And Takyu volleyball is a kind of table tennis, where a ball moves beneath the net and 6 persons play in a team on one side. And you hit with a small board the ball which produces sound. The ball has to be passed more than twice among members of the team before returning the ball to the other side of the table. You are not allowed to stand. You have to be seated so that children, the elderly, and persons with disabilities can join the team. And balloon volleyball uses special balloons which produce sound and are so light to fly and move with small power. It has also special rules. And Japanese NGOs train trainers who can spread these sports in South America and other countries. And the second agenda is sports for development peace that will contribute to a sustainable and resilient society. Under this agenda, we aim at promoting through sport peace building, refugee assistance, poverty alleviation, recovery, and reconstruction from natural disasters. And in Bosnia and Herzegovina, a former Japanese national soccer team captain, Tsuneyoshi Miyamoto, led efforts to the opening of a sports academy named Mari Most, in English, Little Bridge. Children from all ethnic communities learn sports here together. This project aims to promote reconciliation and mutual understanding in the aftermath of conflict. And the Japanese government supports this project with ODA by building a soccer field and a clubhouse. And based on our own experiences, how the stress of people affected by natural disaster can be eased through sport is an important issue for us. And Japanese NGO feel sympathy with those affected by the natural disasters. And this is a good example where Japanese NGO, which had assisted people in Nepal with baseball for more than 15 years, started assistance for recovery through sport right after the earthquake in 2015. And this is another project in Myanmar by Japanese private companies and professional football teams, supports the repair of elementary schools and children's homes. And in Cambodia, still 2 million landmines are buried under the ground, and a Japanese NGO is working for demining to expand the area without landmines. Creating activity in those areas where landmines have been removed is another challenge. And Japanese Volleyball Federation worked with the NGO by giving opportunities for children to play volleyball in the landmine-free area. And Japan Volleyball Federation is continued to be active since 1964. And young leadership training utilizing sports was held for young next generation leaders and selected from all over the world, among others from developing countries affected by the poverty and conflict. And from 2014 to 2016, in total, 90 youth members participated in Young Leaders Camp in Tokyo and Northeast Japan affected by tsunami. And they witnessed also the recovery from the earthquake. And this year, follow-up symposium took place, and 14 participants gave presentation about their project proposals and build networks with SFT consortium members. And the last agenda is protection and promotion of sport integrity that will contribute to a clean and fair society. And under this agenda, we aim at helping build capacity for anti-doping in the developing countries and promote sport values education, including the notion of fair play. And with regard to this agenda, anti-doping became a major and challenging issue. And World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, is a unique private international organization where public authorities, sport movement, including IOC, IPC, and athletes and national and regional anti-doping organizations are united to address the issues and how to coordinate the interest and activities of diverse stakeholders in both efficient and legitimate ways in the global anti-doping mechanism is a very unique challenge in sport and diplomacy. Now, vigorous discussions on the reform of the system is going on through a series of negotiations. And we organize regularly a seminar for capacity building of anti-doping organizations in Asia and Pacific by inviting anti-doping officers. And we have developed an educational package on sports values and anti-doping based on our experiences in Japan. And sport value educations are included in our physical education curriculum for schools, and anti-doping education is included in our curricula for high schools. The educational package is written in English, and this includes guidance for teachers so that it can be utilized easily in other countries. We try to diffuse this package to other countries. So those are our model projects which we would like to promote and increase in number in the years so that we can achieve our target not only in terms of number, but also quality. And improving the quality of project is a challenge. And we make utmost effort to realize this. And in this context, I would like to introduce 5 features of SFT that we always have in mind in formulating the project. And first, we promote public-private partnership by encouraging good collaboration among the consortium members. I have already shown you some good examples of matching know-how, equipment, and financing. The project of managing a sport academy for children from various ethnic groups in Bosnia-Herzegovina is a model case where an NGO provides with software and the government provides with hardware. And second, we should respect the ownership of each country and the involvement of local communities by giving due consideration to local conditions, including culture and tradition, and promoting dialogue and collaboration in partnership. As I mentioned before, Japanese NGO has assisted the government of Cambodia to introduce physical education curricula for its middle schools by adding the traditional Cambodian martial arts, Bokatao, and popular sport in Cambodia, Petang, into the curricula based on Japanese quality physical education method. And third, in deliberating the nature of international cooperation, we give due consideration to individual capacity building, human resources development from a mid to long-term perspective based on the educational benefit of sports. In case of the physical education curricula in Cambodia, we organize seminars and training courses for the teachers in parallel for several years so that the curricula are properly understood and implemented by the teachers on the ground. Fourth, we would like to share with other countries our knowledge and experience on sport or exercise created and proven effective in Japan. I have already introduced some of examples. Lastly, we find it important to consider more effective approaches by sharing knowledge and good practices of such international cooperation and to enhance international discussion on the methodologies of international cooperation. Now I'd like to move on to the last subject on the legacy of SFT beyond 2020. And as I explained before, the targeted years for SFT are 7 years from 2014 to 2020. However, we find it even more important to continue our efforts in a more sustainable way beyond Tokyo 2020. And it is a challenging task, and we have just started with discussion. And we don't have definitive concrete answers yet, but I would like to point out some important elements to be reflected for the consideration on legacy. Beyond 2020, we would like to advance the SFT movement, which entails using the educational aspects of sports in order to work to building people's capacity, strengthen social partnership, and through that to develop further the next generation in a virtuous cycle that will use the power of sports to reform and achieve the society tomorrow. We aim at building ties between Japan and the world through sport and people, and turning SFT from a program to a movement and national culture. And first, whether we can maintain and develop partnership and networks created by SFT project is a key to this end. We find it important continuing all Japan public-private cooperation by developing the SFT consortium, accumulate good practices, and establish culture of common goals and cooperation. Funding will be a challenge for beyond 2020, and we should maintain and develop some institutions created for SFT, such as the international education programs for sports leaders, including Tsukuba International Academy for Sports Studies, which I explained before. And in order to make such a consortium and institution more sustainable, engaging business in such areas as promotion of health through sports should be reflected. And we should expand from projects as starting points to wider networks. In the SFT framework, we are training many coaches, teachers, and young leaders whose networks are crucial for further cooperation in the future. Second, we aim at achieving tangible results through long-term partnership in such fields as raising quality of physical education and spreading of sports originating in Japan. In this context, human resources development, including training teachers and trainers, is a key for making the project sustainable. And we are sending young overseas volunteers every year, including those specialized in sports and physical education. And one of the targets we set for Tokyo 2020 is recording the highest number of participating countries for the Paralympic Games. So far, the highest number was recorded in London. And to this end, we consider supporting countries which will be able to join the Paralympic Games with our assistance in terms of training athletes or building capacities of their national Olympic committees. And thirdly, we aim at improving our own domestic measures and accumulating good practices, which will lead to create a virtuous cycle for international cooperation by improving its methodologies. And regarding women's sport, we signed this April Brighton plus Helsinki 2014 Declaration, together with JOC, JPC, and JSC, and Japan Sports Association to show our commitment. In terms of participation, we are studying good practices, such as this Girl Can campaign of the UK, and will take concrete actions in the future. Japan is often affected by natural disasters, and we have accumulated experience in terms of recovery through sport from natural disasters, and we make the most of our experience to contribute internationally. And we intend to make Rugby World Cup in Tokyo 2020 clean and fair. In this context, in the bipartisan parliamentarian group on sport is drafting a new comprehensive law on anti-doping, which includes the strengthening of intelligence capacity and could be passed in the near future. And we have developed a Paralympic education textbook both in Japanese and English for elementary school students in cooperation with IPC. And fourth, we aim at contributing to improvement of methodology for international cooperation by making use of our experiences of the SFT. And Japan hosted the sport ministers meeting in Tokyo in October last year in the framework of World Forum on Sports and Culture, which is a kickoff event for Tokyo 2020, focusing on the international cooperation. And we intend to share our experiences on SFT at the MINEPS, UNESCO Sport Ministers meeting in Russia in July 2017. And Japan ASEAN Sport Ministers meeting is scheduled this October in Myanmar. And Japan-China Korea Sport Ministers meeting will take place in Japan in 2018. And we will discuss with Asian partners how to enhance cooperation and build regional networks for cooperation beyond 2020. These three countries are hosting respective Olympics and Paralympic Games in the coming years. And lastly, we aim at making sport exchange part of our national culture by making most of events in the coming years. And we expect consortium members to organize large-scale exchanges overseas, such as Kizuna Ekiden in Indonesia and Thailand, where Japanese residents run with people in Indonesia and Thailand in one team for a long-distance relay. And our commissioner ran together in Indonesia last year. And not only abroad, but also in Japan, we will expand sport exchanges with foreign citizens in coming years, which includes sports events and sport tourism, such as citizen marathon, cycling and walking, as well as host town initiatives for Tokyo 2020, which involved so far 138 local governments, organizing cultural, and sport exchange at the local level. And the number of host towns will increase further. And UK has many partner towns in Japan, as shown on next slides. The partner town of the UK is highlighted in red. And we see another 4 partners of the UK here. And we would like to make the most of the series of sports events, including golden years from 2019 to 2021 and beyond. And we hope that every Japanese will have a chance to enjoy sports with foreign visitors by doing, watching, and supporting sports at every corner of Japan. And in concluding, I stress again the importance of a partnership between the UK and Japan. The Olympic and Paralympic flag were handed over from London through Rio to Tokyo with rich and insightful knowledge and experiences. And I attended the signing ceremony between British Olympic Association and Kanagawa and Yokohama City and the Keio University on the arrangement of camping sites for Tokyo 2020. And UK is very quick to take action. So I look forward to working with you in the coming years and beyond. And thank you very much.